Hello everyone, welcome to another tutorial in this full stack Flutter development series. We are in our authentication module, where in the previous video we looked at creating that module in Flutter. And in this video and subsequent videos, we'll be looking at creating the backend for our authentication module. And we'll be using Typescript along with Nodejs and MongoDB for our database. So to get started with this video, you will have to go to the Nodejs site, nodejs.org, and to download and install the current version of Node.js. And when you install this, it will comes with the npm package manager that will be used to install various packages we'll be using in creating our authentication backend. You will also need to go to typescript.lang.org and also follow the instruction here as how to install Typescript. And the G here means that you'll be installing it globally. So first you will have to install Node.js so that you will have access to npm. And then you'll use npm at your command line and install Typescript globally on your computer. And so now that we have Node.js and Typescript set up, we can now jump into Visual Studio Code and set up our backend project. So here in Visual Studio Code, I have an empty folder called Food Ordering Backend. And I'll be creating my Node.js backend here. So to get started, I will go into the command line and I'll run npm init. And this will initialize a new npm project. But as you can see here, it is asking me for the package name. So I'm going to call it food app backend. And it's gonna ask me some more questions and I'm just gonna skip through. Then yes, so everything is okay, and this will generate our package.json file. So inside our package.json file, we'll see a few things. We'll see the name, a version, and I can give it a description. And I'll just say food app backend. And inside of scripts is where we'll be writing our scripts, our test script, our build script, and our run script. But for now, we're just gonna leave it as it is. And so we're gonna get started by installing a few dev dependencies, dev packages that are necessary. So I'll go to the command line again, and to install a package in Node.js, you'll have to use the npm package or the node package manager. So I want to start out by installing, saying npm I to install, and I'm going to use -d as a dev dependency, and I'm going to install Typescript, and I'm also going to install tsnode, and I'm going to install mocha for my testing framework, and also chai for my assertion framework. So I'm going to install those 4 packages to begin with. So if I click to install, so now you can see that inside my package.json file, I have now a dev dependency. So I have chai, mocha, TS Node TypeScript, and I have the modules, this node module now appearing here where all those dependencies are. But since this is not important in the overall scope of the project in terms of writing code, I'm just gonna use my handy extension to hide this folder along with the VS Code, and I'm going to create a source folder where I'll put my development artifacts. Now I'll go back to my script and I am going to write a test script, and by test script I mean whenever I run this script will run the set of tests in my application. So I'm going to use Mocha, which is the test library, the testing framework, and I'm going to use some flags that it requires TS node register. I'm going to say watch for TypeScript extensions. Watch extensions TS, and the path to my test files will be in the folder test, wildcard, and my test files will be prefixed, or will end rather with spec.ts. And I'm going to set a timeout. I'm going to set a timeout for the test for 5 seconds. So that is my test script that I'll be using. I'll also initialize the TypeScript compiler to generate a TS or a TypeScript config file. So I'll say tsc init, and this should generate a TypeScript config file. So the command is tsc / or -- init, and that command will generate a ts config file in our root directory, and this will give us some options as to how we want TypeScript to behave, the compiler options. So I want to uncomment lib, and in here I want to add ES 2015. And for now, I'm just gonna leave it as it is. For those of you who may not be familiar with TypeScript and wondering what is TypeScript, TypeScript is basically a super set of JavaScript, and it gives us a language that is type friendly, type safe, and allows us to use concepts like interfaces that are not readily available in JavaScript. But even though the application is developed in TypeScript, it will eventually be compiled to JavaScript when we run our build script at the end. So now let us create our test folder. So I have a source folder, and I'm going to create a test folder. And this is where Mocha will look for my test files to compile them. So inside my source folder now, I am going to create another folder, and I'm going to call it auth, since I'm starting out in my authentication module. And in my auth module, I'm going to create another folder and I'm going to call it domain, which represents those domain objects or models. So I have my domain, and inside my domain, I am going to create two files. I am going to create a user TS file since we are using TypeScript. And I am going to create an interface for our repository, since we'll be using a repository as an abstraction that sits above our Mongo database, so that our application is not dependent on Mongo itself. So for our user, I am going to create a class. So inside of TypeScript, how we create a class, we will say export default class user. It's very similar to a lot of programming languages that we're used to already. And I'm going to create the constructor. And the thing about TypeScript is that I can create all the fields associated with this class from inside the constructor itself. So I'm going to say public. I'm going to make it read only. Say the user ID and of type string. Then I'll create the rest of the fields. So public read only name. Email. And there, all these fields will be string. Public read only password string, and public read only type. This type represents our authentication type, whether it is email or Google. So there we have our user class. And now inside of our authentication file, I am going to create an interface. So I'm going to say export again default, this time an interface, and I'm going to call it iAuth repository. And this repository, I'm going to have a method that says find by the email address. This method will return a promise, and promise in the realm of JavaScript is basically the same thing as a future in the Flutter realm. So it's asynchronous programming, same concept. User, and I'll import that, and I'll add, and then I'll pass in the properties of the user that I want to add. So that will be the name, the email, I'm going to pass in a password. I'm going to say password hash. since I won't be passing in the raw password and also the type. And this will return a promise also. But this time the promise will be a string, which will represent the user ID. So there we have our interface. So now we will be creating our use case or sign in use case. So I'll go to auth and I'll create another folder and I'll call it use cases. So inside our use cases folder, I am going to create a sign in use case. So again, export default class sign in use case. And I want for its dependencies, I want a auth repository. I'm going to make this private auth repository of type iauth repository. iauth repository. And then I want my public method, which is an async method, execute to execute this use case. And this use case will take an email and a password. So I'll take an email and a password, and again it will return a promise, which is of type string. So I'm going to say that the user should await, and I'll call the find method from the repository, and I'll pass it the email, then I'm going to check if the password that I pass in was empty and a user is found based on the email, therefore means that I'm trying to authenticate using Google or some other auth service. So I'll just return the user ID because I would have been authenticated with Google, and therefore I'll be just sending in an email without a password. Otherwise, if there is a password, then I need to compare that password to the password that is a part of the returned user from the repository. But as I said, we will not be storing the password as raw text in the database. We'll be using a hash. So we'll be using a service, a hash service for that. So I'm going to add that as a dependency also, even though I have not created it yet. So I'm going to say password service, and I'm going to call the interface iPassword service. Now this password service will be an application service. It will be specific to this application. It's not considered a domain service, but an application service that is required for this particular application. So I'm going to create a folder called services, and inside services will be the application services, or those application services abstraction, which will be later implemented in our infrastructure/data layer. So for now, I'm going to say iPassword service. And further down, I'll be using this library known as Bcrypt to handle password hashing and comparison. So again, export default interface, and I'll call it iPassword service. Then inside of our service, I'll create two methods. One method hash, which accepts a password as the raw string or the raw password text, and will generate a hash and return that hash. So again, it will be an async function, so returns a promise of type string, and also another method called compare. And this method will take in the raw password and also the hash string for that password, and will compare the two using some algorithm and return a boolean to determine if the password matches, the raw text matches the hash version of that text. So those are the two methods inside my iPassword service. So back inside my use case, I'll just import my iPassword service, and then I'll use that service here to compare the password if a password was given. So if no password was given, then it will check to see if the user was found and return the user ID. Otherwise, if I'm going to say await this password service, password service, this should be private. So private password service at compare, and I'm going to pass in the password that was passed and also the user password, which will be a hash that is returned from the database. And I'll compare that, and I'll see if it is false, then I'm going to reject the promise. I'm going to say promise reject, or return a promise rejection with the message invalid email or password. Otherwise, I am going to just return the user ID. So there we have our use case. So now to test our use case, we will go to our test folder. Again, I'll create a folder called auth, and inside that folder, another folder called use cases, and I'll create the sign in use case dot spec dot ts, and the spec is just a general practice for test files, or naming convention for test files in JavaScript and TypeScript, the Nodejs world. So I'll create my test folder, my test file rather, and from that I will import the test frameworks that I will use. So I will import mocha. So I'll say import mocha. I'll also import chai, which is our assertion library. So I'll import chai, and I'll import or expect from the chai framework or library or package, whatever you choose to call it. So as you can see, it's giving me here an error that I have no types for chai. So I will have to go here to my command line and say npm install as a dev dependency at types chai. And that should clear up that error because it installed those TypeScript types. And I think I need to install the same for mocha. So I'll go ahead and install the same for mocha if I did not install it already. So there we go. So to do our test, you will first use what is called describe. So this is from the mocha library. So describe, this is similar to group in the Flutter testing framework. So I'm going to just say describe sign in use case. And it's very similar to how testing is done in Flutter. So I have my function here, and here I'll set up those global test dependencies. So I'll say let my system under test be the sign in use case, and I'll say let the repository be iAuth repository, and let the password service be of type password service, and I am going to create a user object also, which I already have. I'm just going to copy and paste that user object, and then I'll say before each test I want to set up my dependencies. So here's where I now configure my dependencies. So I'll say repository equal. I will have to create a fake repository here. So instead of using mocks, I will create a fake repository and also a fake password service. So password service equal new fake password service. And then I will pass those to my use case. So new sign in use case, and I'll pass in my repository and my password service. So that's how I would configure my tests before it is executed. So I'll now create those fake objects, create a folder, and I'll call it helpers. And inside that, I'll create my fake repository, TS. So for my fake repository, I implement my iAuth repository, and then I create a list of users, well, 2 users in this case, and then I'll implement those methods. A find method where I'll check if the email exists for a user, and if it is not found, I'll throw an error that user is not there, or in this case I could say return promise reject user is not found, else I'll create a new user and return that user. The same thing with the add. A new user is created and added to the list. So that is my fake repository, and I'll now create my fake password service. So fake password service TS. And so here's my fake password service. Implements the password service protocol or contract or interface. Create the hash method, which just return the password, the same password, and also the compare method, which just compare what is passed in the hash and the password and return true or false. So that's my fake repository, and that's my fake password service. So I'll just import those here. And there we have our setup for our test. So for my first test, I want to write, I'm going to say it, and I'm going to say it should throw an error when the user is not found. So if I enter incorrect email and the user is not found, so I'll just throw an error. So I'm going to create a user. I'm just going to say email. Just going to say wrong email. And for the password, just gonna say 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll just do my assertion and say await, expect SUT, I'm going to say execute user email path. pass in the user password also, and I'm going to expect it to be rejected. Now, rejected is not a part of the Chai framework itself. So I'll have to install an additional framework that deals with promises or asynchronous methods. And it's a framework known as Chai as promised, or a library. So I'll go again into my terminal and I'll say npm I. Again, it's a dev dependency, so D, and I'll install Chai as promised. So I'll install that, and I'll also install the types so that it can work with TypeScript. So type slash Chai as promised. Great. So now I will import Chai as promised from, you guessed it right, Chai as promised. And then I will tell Chai just at the top of the application, I'm going to tell it to use this, what is called a middleware, Chai as promised. So configure Chai to use this middleware. And now we should have access to those promise assertions. So rejected with, there we have rejected with, and I'll say rejected with user not found. So this is what I am expecting. So to run this, I'll go to the terminal and I'll say npm run test. And if you remember our package.json file, this test script is now this is what will be ran. So from the terminal, say npm run test, it will run this script, and this script will look through the test folder for all those spec files and execute the test. So if I run that, then I see that I am having errors. So I'll have to, it says that reference Chai is not defined. So I'll have to look at that. And as you can see in our imports, Chai is really not defined. So I am going to say Chai. So I'm going to import a reference to Chai and also the expect from Chai and use it there. So again, if I run the test, let us see what will happen. Look at that. There we have a passing test. They should throw an error when the user is not found. And there we have a passing test. But we do not want to run our test like this always from the command line, because this will run all the spec files. So we want a mechanism to allow us to run a single test. And so that is where we'll configure VS Code to run a single test. So to get that done, we have to install some extensions. So we'll have to install the mocha extension. So here we have to install mocha test, and we'll have to install the mocha test explorer. So mocha test and mocha test Explorer. We need those two VS Code extensions. And after we have installed that, we need to go to our JSON or settings, and we need to add these two options. So Mocha Explorer files, and we give it the path to the files, and Explorer require the TS node register. So we need those two in order for it to work. So now if we go to our test sidebar icon here in VS Code, then we should find Test Explorer, and then we should click the reload tests. And what will happen is that it will show the test here, and then you will see an option beside the test and also some methods to run or to debug the test. So you can use that to run a single test, and then when it is passing, we'll have an arrow here. So let us write the remaining tests. So here I have quickly wrote a few more tests. So I said that it should return the user ID when the email and the password is correct. So I enter a correct email and a correct password from this user, which is in the fake repository. And then when I run the test, as you can see, it is a successful test. And here's another one that it should return the user ID when the email is correct and the type is not email, meaning that it is Google or some other OAuth service. So the password should be blank for such a service. And then I run, and as you can see, the test is passing. If I enter some password, then this test should result in a failure. So if I run it again, then you see I'm now having a failing test. So I remove that run. Now the test is passing. So I will stop there for now. So there you have it, guys. We have created our sign in and tested our sign in use case in our Typescript Node.js backend. And again, remember that you need to install the mocha extension, and also the mocha test explorer in order for you to have these options to run the test. So you need the mocha extension and the mocha test explorer. So see you in the next one, guys, and the code will be on GitHub for those who want to follow along.